Survivors, Flood, Mississippi, 1927, Chapter 11. Garrett picked up the knife and used it to flip the severed snake head into the water. Then he eyed the still convulsing body as he put the knife back into the sack and tied it shut. The snake's muscles would continue to spasm for a half-hour or more. Rain was beating on the smooth gray-brown scales. Maybe we should keep it. If we could just make a fire somewhere. He pushed the dog aside firmly and shook a finger in its face. You hush now. He looked over his shoulder at Molly. We could skin it and eat it. She didn't answer him. The dog had quieted, still staring at the headless snake. Still bristling, it came forward, lowering its muzzle. Hey, Garrett. He glanced at Molly. She was pointing. He turned to look. 100 yards off was a little hump of land sticking up out of the muddy water. There were trees hanging over a low-slung old house. Through the rain, Garrett thought he saw a wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. He glanced at Molly. I was going to surprise you, she said, shivering. She sank onto the logs and leaned over the side of the raft to wash her hands in the water. I thought maybe we could see what's in the house. Maybe they left some food behind. Garrett squinted. Somebody's still there. I can see smoke. Molly wiped at her face. Maybe they'll let us come in and get warm. Garrett nodded, turning to grab the drawer front. He went to the back of the raft and sat down, a rivulet of rain running from his hair down his shirt. If you sit on that side, we can take turns. These blisters are pretty bad. He flexed his right hand as Molly sat down opposite him. Trading off every 4 or 5 strokes, they moved the raft steadily over the nearly still water. The dog was still nosing at the snake, snuffling and growling. Get away, Molly called to the dog. I'm not going to eat it after you get finished drooling all over it. Garrett nudged the dog with his foot. It went to lie down near Molly. It's an old place, I think, Molly said as they got closer. Garrett nodded. It sure looks like one. He could see a path on one side that rose up out of the water and looked like it led to the house. Aim for that, he said to Molly, gesturing. He dragged the paddle to turn the raft slightly, grimacing as his blisters stung. When they traded off again, Molly kept the same course. They bumped into the soft dirt, only 5 or 6 feet to one side of the path. The dog jumped past Garrett and sprang off the raft. Garrett could see sharp tracks in the soft dirt. This trail had been worn by cows' hooves. Garrett glanced back out over the water. Where was the barn? It was strange to think that a whole farm, except for the house, had been covered by water. But that was probably what had happened here. Maybe we should call out first, Molly cautioned, standing with her arms out for balance as the raft settled against the shoreline. They can hardly be expecting company. Garrett cupped his hands around his mouth. Hello! He stepped out onto the dirt, his legs stiff and clumsy. The ground felt too solid, strange, and immobile beneath his feet. Molly jumped off, bumping into him from behind. Together they dragged the raft above the waterline. Molly opened the sack and fashioned a short tie rope out of the twine. I think it'll hold. What about the snake? Garrett bent to tug at the twine. It was as strong as they could make it. Leave it here for now. If there's any choice, I don't want to eat it. Me either, Molly said as she followed him up the path. Garrett stopped and whistled for the dog. It came bursting out of the plum thicket, and Molly grabbed at it as it went past. She kept it close as they stepped into the yard. Garrett shouted again. This time he heard a voice from inside. He glanced at Molly, noticing the mad tangle of her hair and the mud stains on her dress. He could hardly look any better. He ran his fingers through his hair and nudged Molly. She straightened her dress and pulled her hair back, then stood up, squaring her shoulders. You look pretty good for a half-drowned snake killer, he said in mock serious voice. Molly flashed him one of her quick grins. Then the house door banged open hard enough to rattle the front window. Who is that? Who is calling out there? Garrett stepped forward so the man could see him clearly. Me and Molly here got washed down river on a raft, sir. We surely didn't mean to give you a start. The man started, then laughed aloud. Son, my house is the only thing above water for miles. All my neighbors have run for high ground at Vicksburg. I have seen 15 snakes, 2 gators, and a floating church. It'd take more than 2 muddy children and a mutt to give me a start. Garrett smiled, expecting the man to return it, but he didn't. The dog broke free of Molly's grip and ran up to the man, slinking low as it got close, begging for attention. The man bent down and patted its skinny side. "You ought to feed your dog." "Better, boy," he said as he scratched the dog's ears. "It's not mine," Garrett told him. "We found it on the river. Molly nearly drowned saving it." The man strained, looking at Molly. "A lot of folks would leave a dog to die." He continued to stare at them. When he spoke again, his voice was a little friendlier. "I suppose, since you're here, the polite thing is to ask you in." Once again Garrett smiled, and once more the man did not respond. "We have a dead snake on the raft," Garrett said. "A big cottonmouth. If you have a fire, we could—" But the man was already shaking his head. "I will eat gator. I will eat armadillo. I will eat squirrel and possum and coon. I will not eat snake." Garrett shifted his weight from one foot to the other, blinking rain out of his eyes. The man was really old, he realized, in spite of his forceful voice. He was leaning on the porch rail. "We would surely appreciate a little something to eat, mister," Molly said in a quivery voice. Her teeth were chattering. There was a small, awkward silence, and the old man took a half step backward. "Come in out of the rain, then." The dog followed at his heels. Garrett led the way across the muddy yard, past a slanted roof shed. There were fig trees off to one side of the house, and a stand of blackberries grew along the other. The place was neat and well kept. There was a little patch of strawberries in a box planter, and a woven cane lattice set up to keep animals out. At the bottom of the house steps Garrett hesitated, waiting for Molly to catch up. Her eyes were wide with interest as she passed the strawberry bed. "That's sure pretty," she said, pointing. The old man ignored her and banged the door once again. He went inside without a backward glance, the dog right behind him. "Why is he so unfriendly?" Molly whispered as Garrett opened the door. Garrett shrugged, touching one finger to his lips. Molly nodded, and they stepped in out of the rain. Garrett blinked. The inside of the house was dimly lit. There was a low fire in a massive stone hearth, and a candle sitting in a tin can on a table. The dog circled twice, then lay down in front of the fire. Garrett saw an electric light fixture on the ceiling. "The rain knock out your Delco plant?" he asked. "No," the old man replied instantly. "It was a flock of white crows." He gestured toward the front window. "Came flying in yesterday about sunup." Garrett felt a wave of anger rise inside him at the old man's teasing. "Mister, we are about as tired and cold and hungry as can be. We didn't mean to barge in on you like this, but—" "No, son," the man interrupted, going to stand before the fire. "You are not nearly as wet and cold and tired as you might be." The orangish light made the creases in his face look deep, each one a dark line. He crossed his arms, and Garrett noticed that his right hand was missing most of its fingers. "The stew's been cooking all day," the old man said. He went to a cupboard and took out 3 mismatched china bowls. "How long have you been here alone?" Molly asked, moving to stand near the fire. Garrett tried to signal her. This old man didn't seem to want much conversation, but Molly either didn't see his gesture or she ignored it. "You have family, mister?" Garrett waited for the old man to snap at Molly and tell him that it was none of their take their noisy business back out to the raft, but he didn't. He just began dishing up the stew. Once they each had a full belly and a spoon, they sat cross-legged on the floor by the fire. Then the old man settled back into his easy chair, facing the hearth. He stirred his stew noisily, blowing at it to cool it off. Outside the rain fell harder, a sleepy thrumming on the roof. "I did have a big family," the old man said quietly. "Outlived all but 3. My son is up in Greenville. My brother and his wife went out to California in '21. I got a letter at Christmas. They have an orange tree in their yard out there." Garrett watched Molly nodding, her eyes big as she imagined the orange tree. He took a bite of the stew and scalded his tongue. The dog raised its head and then rested it on his front paws, sniffing at the warm odor of onions and meat. "You ever go visit out there?" Molly was asking in between bites. "Once," the old man said. "It's a long trip for old bones." Molly nodded at that, too. Garrett blew on a mouthful of stew, then gulped it down. The chill from the rain was leaving him, and he stopped shivering. The old man was still stirring and blowing. "Where are the 2 of you from, then?" Molly nudged Garrett, and he cleared his throat. "Mayersville, sir." "Mayersville," the old man said, as though Garrett had named some grand city. "I've never been up that way. The war mostly took me south." Garrett stared at him. Mr. Talbot had fought in the Great War over in Europe. So had Bubba Lawler. Neither one of them even had gray hair yet. Suddenly Garrett realized what the old man meant. "You fought in the war between the states." The old man nodded. "I did. Ended up with Lieutenant General Pemberton at Vicksburg, and he had true Southern blood, no matter what they say." Garrett felt Molly stiffen. He was unsure what to say or do. A splatter of rain hit the front window. "My family never owned a slave," the old man said, staring into the fire. "We were poor and proud to do our own work. But I hated that government in Washington telling us what to do. If they had let us alone—" "Is that what happened to your hand?" Garrett blurted out, hoping to turn the conversation away from slavery. "Gun misfired," the old man said. "We surely lost that war. I doubt old Dixie will ever recover." The old man sat quietly after he finished talking, stirring the bowl of stew. "My mama says President Coolidge could fix us up with farm relief," Garrett said into the silence that had gathered in the room. "Maybe," the old man said. "Maybe not. It'd take a whole lot of relief to put Warren County to rights." The only sound was the snapping of the fire and the muted bubbling of the stew pot. Garrett finished eating and set his bowl on the hearth. The dog whimpered. The old man stopped stirring and stuck his thumb straight down into the stew. Cool enough. He leaned to set the bowl in front of the dog. It scrambled to its feet and began lapping at the stew. Garrett kept glancing at Molly, wondering what she was thinking. If this old man had won his war, she might have been born a slave. "Mayersville is up in Issaquena County, isn't it?" the old man asked. "Yes," Garrett told him, "up around Rolling Fork." Molly set down her dish, her eyes clouded and distant. "I reckon you two are about 70, 80 miles from home, then. You're not all that far from Vicksburg." Garrett heard Molly pull up in an astonished breath. He realized he had opened his own mouth and closed it, not knowing what to say. The old man began to laugh. He tilted his head backward, aiming his merriment at the smoke-stained ceiling. He laughed for so long that Garrett saw Molly smile faintly. "I'm sorry," the old man said finally, wiping at his eyes. "You should have seen your faces. Old man Mississippi carried you off farther than you ever thought you'd go, didn't he? Did the same to me once." A sudden rumble of thunder startled Garrett. The dog lifted its ears, cocked its head to one side. Garrett looked out the window in time to see a brilliant flash of blue-white lightning. A second later, thunder shook the house. Then the clouds opened and the rain came down so hard that it was almost impossible to hear the old man when he spoke. "You two better pull your raft up into the yard before you lose it down river." Garrett stood up and went to the door, Molly right behind him. As they stepped out into the downpour, lightning crackled overhead and struck somewhere so close that Garrett felt the ground rumble.